everybody. My name is Joshua Jacob, and I'm an 11th grade student here at ISL. And as part of the YFS 2019 team, I would like to welcome you to what I know will be a very perceptive and insightful conversation on how we can plan today to ensure for sustainable cities of tomorrow. Before we begin, I just need a quick moment to explain the process and procedure of the next hour. There'll be 2 talks given by 2 different professionals specialized in sustainable cities of the future. After they've finished speaking, there'll be an opportunity for you guys to ask some questions to the speakers. If you're interested in further discussing any of the topics, you can approach the speakers at another time during the day. It is my great pleasure to be able to open this session by saying a few words about the event and the speakers you're about to hear from. As more and more people move from the countryside to life in cities, their design and planning is being challenged. How do we accommodate for these new needs in transportation, mobility, safety, infrastructure, and pollution control? How can we create physically sustainable communities? These are just a few of the fascinating questions that I'm sure will be answered during this talk. First, we will have Kees Christiaanse, who was a professor at ETH Zurich. Professor Christiaanse is an architect, urban planner, and founder of KCAP Architects and Planners, with offices in Rotterdam, Shanghai, and here in Zurich. In his work, he focuses on urban assignments in complex situations and on guiding urban processes. He's an expert in the development of university campuses and in the revitalization of formal industrial, railway, and harbor areas, and is a supervisor of several international urban developments. Carolyn Steel will be giving our second talk. As you can see, we have some fascinating talks in store for you, so without further ado, could you please join me in welcoming our first speaker, Professor Kees Christiaanse, to the stage.
Thank you very much. The screens are standing in such a way that I have to stand here, so if I top over, it's due to the fact that I have to look at my screen to talk. I'm going to talk about several themes that we have worked on and we worked on. I tend to work from several perspectives, develop certain themes, both in theoretical and research way, and then implement them also in practice in our work. The first theme is Open City, which is a title of the Biennale of Architecture Rotterdam 2009 that I curated, and it is about how cities can accommodate conditions, can develop conditions in order for society to flourish. And you see 2 diagrams on the right. The one diagram shows in the top the tendency of the functional city that mostly happens on the moment that there is no governance steering those cities. It leads to a situation in which neighborhoods develop connected to an infrastructural system with only single access. Neighborhoods become most of the time monofunctional, like this campus here. There's not much living going on or urbanity going on. And so you get a city in which the different parts do not communicate with each other. And we are advocates of a system where you have a multi-directional public space system, let's say streets that are perpendicular and form a grid, form blocks, and within those blocks, depending on the building typologies, different communities can settle. You see that by those colored blocks. That then consequently are going to confront with each other and create interaction, and due to the interaction there is an urban culture emerging in which innovation and economic development is fostered. This is a kind of basic principle of a quality urban environment. And one of the mothers of this thinking was Jane Jacobs. You see her here with me in 1991. She wrote the famous book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, which is the first book actually that consciously deals with this idea of open city. She wrote a lot of books. She also wrote The Economy of Cities, which is a very funny book because it's a kind of, it's not scientific, it's more like a kind of belly book. And in this book she writes that the city was first there and then agriculture emerged. That's something interesting for Caroline also. She says that in order to have architecture emerge and develop, there was need for interaction in order to cross-fertilize plants and animals in order to kind of get the engine of agriculture going. It's a very funny book to read. This is the HafenCity Hamburg, and in red you see the planning that we have done for the city of Hamburg. At the north of the river Elbe, you see the HafenCity, which is the most comprehensive waterfront development in Europe. And on the south side you see the former Olympic site, which now is going to be developed as a new neighborhood. And you see very clearly that it consists of a system of streets, parks, squares, quays on the water that are having a networked effect. And this network effect takes care that different activities and people are in this mesh, fostering interaction with each other and therefore creating a sustainable urban culture that gradually builds up a societal humus, if you want. The second theme that I would like to show you, which is in the continuation of this open city, is called Urban Breeding Grounds. This is about cities where, for instance, 19th century neighborhoods have been living in the process of open city for a longer time, 20 years, 50 years, and therefore have developed a certain societal quality. And these neighborhoods can be conceived as breeding grounds for small-scale economic development, for cultural development, and for societal exchange. And of course, in the words of Richard Florida, this produces also the exchange of talents and therefore innovation. So we worked on these projects both in Europe as well as in Asia, and we did two researches in China, one in Shenzhen, which is called State Beyond State, and one in Shanghai, which is called Urban Loopholes, which deals with this problem. We are working, for instance, on this moment on the city center of Shenzhen, which is an area of 78.8 square kilometers, which is an area that you see here on the left top image, and also in the other three, but the left top image is the original top-down planning idea of the Chinese government and the government of Shenzhen Economic Zone for the center of this city. And what actually happened is that you see those other three pictures. In those other three pictures, you see informal settlements emerged out of villages and of old factories that have been abandoned and reoccupied and have been subject to settlement of all kinds of entrepreneurship and guest workers, and therefore produce this kind of societal humus that I just mentioned. And the situation now in Shenzhen is that the actual city center is dead. Every center and every official planning node in the city that the government originally planned is virtually dead. There's no life. And all those informal areas, they are very active and very vibrant. So they have acknowledged this after 25 or 30 years of life, and we are now working for the government there to see if we can turn the dead centers into vibrant areas, and in analogy to these informal settlements that have been emerging. This is extremely special because it means that the government has to acknowledge an enormous planning mistake, an enormous policy mistake, and consequently has to adopt principles that have actually been the result of subversive activity. So it's a very interesting way of working. What we do, this is the third theme, which is called Urban Design Guidelines. Very simple. We are working not as so-called Beaux-Arts designers. We do not say, oh, let's make a beautiful street and a landmark at the end. No, we are setting rules in which this open city condition or this urban breeding ground condition can flourish, which is a kind of action of control and laissez-faire. So here you see, for instance, the result of the high-rise building concept that we developed for the city of Rotterdam in the Netherlands, where I come from. It is a system of rules in which the basic podium of the city has to be preserved in order to create this vibrant, multi-directional quality. And then on top of it, people are allowed to build high-rise buildings in order to create more density and more exchange. And these high-rises are subject to different rules, but we do not exactly say what they should look like, where exactly they should stand. There's a lot of freedom. So our working on the city is not a kind of determination or a definition of fixed ideas. It's more a control of laissez-faire and a kind of governance or curating or directing of different forces. Next theme that is also part of this thinking is called City as Loft, which is effectively the idea of a loft. You all know what a loft is. This is a loft, for instance, in which you have a big space with various activities that are actually in this space in a kind of relationship that is rather loose. And the idea of city as loft is actually that in certain areas like former harbor areas or warehouses on waterfronts or in industrial sites, this idea of loft is exported into public space and develops a kind of quality public space of creative activities that also fosters this open city idea that I talked to you about in the beginning. For instance, this is a warehouse, and you see we have built some buildings on top of it that are standing on top of this warehouse. And when we started on this project, it was a project that was going to be a very expensive project with lawyers' offices and very expensive restaurants and apartments with penthouses. And we and the city said to the developer, don't do it. We can promise you that if you take in 25% social housing, if you allocate a couple of the warehouses to rehearsal rooms for bands or theater, etc., then your development will in the end have a greater value and a better return than when you only create very expensive projects out of that. And so one of the restaurants in the basement, which was part of our programming, is the restaurant 15, which is established by Jamie Oliver, famous cook in England, who, by the way, was raised by Red Rogers in the River Café, which was the original canteen of the architecture office of Richard Rogers, and then became one of the most famous restaurants in London. And Jamie Oliver, he created a formula called 15, in which the restaurants are being operated by ex-delinquent youth, so by youth that have been condemned for prison and other punishments that are reintegrated into society. So what you see now in this development is that the very expensive lawyers and managers are having lunch being served by ex-criminal youth. And this is, let's say, what we call this kind of fusion of open city and urban breeding grounds that we like to promote in the city. Connected to that is the idea of urban made. This is about the reintroduction of manufacturing into the city. It's a very important movement because traditionally manufacturing emigrated out of the city, and you get an enormous amount of commuting, and you get an enormous amount of separation. And on this moment, there's a tendency for manufacturing to come back into the city. And we are working, for instance, here in the city center of Zurich on old railway areas where vertical factories are being produced. You see these little white volumes on top of the buildings in which clean and emission-free production is reintegrated into the city, creating a kind of new mixture of urbanity which is very fruitful for the city as well. And the last theme I would like to talk to you about is about what I call inversion and subtraction in design. We are working a lot into the landscape, specifically in difficult conditions, for instance in airport areas where we regulate the urbanization. And we try to use, for instance, the regulations for noise reduction as a positive factor for urban design. This is the agglomeration of Amsterdam. The top left one you see Amsterdam with its contour of the airport runway noise contours. You see them here, and you see them also here. And what actually our statement is that if the airport would not be there, there's of course a tendency to kind of pull the airport out of the city, put it somewhere in the sea or something like that. Citizens of cities don't like airports, although they use them as much as possible. And we say, okay, why don't you look at the airports from a positive way? If the airport wouldn't have been there, probably Amsterdam would look like this. So the airport actually keeps your city contained and creates a sharp edge between the landscape and the city if you plan it in the right way. So this is what we do. I was 5 years responsible for the urban development of Amsterdam Airport, and I'm also advising Zurich Airport and Singapore Airport. We created a kind of landscape park out of the whole runway system, and the contour around this landscape park is exactly the noise contour out of which you are not allowed to build residential buildings anymore. And the edge we kind of developed into a landscape park where you see, for instance, on the left-hand side, a park that has certain reliefs of dikes that disperse also the noise. It's one of the most popular parks in the vicinity of Amsterdam. You can look at landing planes and at the same time play between those dikes. This all is also culminating in a project called Grand Project. Of course, I'm a small-scale, bottom-up fan, but you cannot go around top-down decisions in today's world. And the most big danger is that you are going to say, okay, I'm either a person whose inclination is to be on the top-down level or on the bottom-up level. You have to work and to work onto a kind of a reconciliation of large-scale development decisions on the one hand, and allow for grassroots initiatives within those frameworks on the other hand. That's what we do, and we call this Grand Project. And we investigate how very big projects are emerging in the city, and then also applying them themselves. This is the high-speed railway station quarter in Singapore that we have designed. And this is, of course, a high-density project, which is also often very strongly condemned by people of the small-scale economy faction. But actually, these high-rises, they have a specific quality. First of all, they are subject to a 100% green replacement rule, which means that they have to recreate green, which is water absorbing and climate regulating, on the level of their roofs, as you can see. And secondly, the building blocks that are here are completely in their communal spaces subject to no air conditioning and natural ventilation, which is a very specific quality. And this is all what I just said you can all read about in a couple of publications. You saw that the titles of these teams are books. One of the last ones is the Potato Plant Collection, which is a way of looking at how cities work, inspired by Patrick Abercrombie, who made the Plan of London in 1944, which is called the Potato Plan, which is still the best representation of the organism of a city that I know, that I have ever seen in my life. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. Carolyn Steel will be giving her second talk. Having taught in Cambridge University, London Metropolitan University, and the London School of Economics, Ms. Steel is a leading thinker on food and cities. Her 2008 book, Hungry City: How Food Shapes Our Lives, won international acclaim, and her concept of cytopia, meaning food place, is widely recognized in the emergent field of food urbanism. Now if you could join me in welcoming Ms. Steel to the stage.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Joshua, and many thanks indeed for inviting me here. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm going to talk for about 18 minutes about a subject that really is, I often say, too big to see. And it's the invisible thing without which none of us would be here: food. So we think of cities as something like this image I have here. That's a shot of Tokyo, a city of nearly 40 million people, astonishing. As I'm sure many of you know, the world is predicted to be urban in the future, so by 2050, 70 to 75% of the global population is expected to live in cities. And if you think what that means, it actually has implications way beyond just a bunch of buildings conglomerated somewhere. In fact, I would say that's a really inaccurate image of the urban future, because the reality of the urban future is more like this. And this is because a city can't feed itself. And I call this the urban paradox. Why can't a city feed itself? Because it's co-evolved, and it's very interesting that Kees brought up the Jane Jacobs book, the Urban Economy book. Actually, cities and countryside have co-evolved, and cities and agriculture have co-evolved. And today, increasingly, what we have is large urban conglomerations in certain parts of the world, and large agricultural, you could almost say industrial agricultural landscapes that are thousands of miles away that we don't see. And part of the reason that we don't think about this relationship is simply because we can't see where our food comes from. Now, historically, that wasn't the case. So the very earliest cities that were built, and I'm not going to get into the question of whether cities or agriculture came first, I think it's safe to say they co-evolved in any case. But if we look at a very, very early city like this one, this is the city of Ur in ancient Mesopotamia, one of the earliest ever built, we see certain things about it straight away. We say it's very small, that's about 1/2 kilometre across. It's very dense, so that little bit of excavated residential area in there would have been the whole city. It would have been full of, effectively, mud houses. And it's on a river, very importantly, the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, hence the name Mesopotamia, between two rivers, that's what Mesopotamia means. And it's surrounded by farmland. And very interesting, you can see this huge temple complex in the middle. That was critical, because the temple not only organised the harvest, so it organised the gathering in of grain and so on, and offered it up to the gods, but it stored it in this building here, which is a huge municipal granary, and then cooked the grain, baked it into bread in a temple kitchen, and then distributed it back to the city. So if we were going to use modern terminology to say how did the first cities on Earth feed themselves, we would say they were city-states. A city-state is an intense blob of urbanity surrounded by farmland. That's what a city-state is. With, again in modern terminology, a large centralised food distribution hub. That's what we would call that now. They called it the temple, and their gods lived there. Now, why did cities evolve like this? I often like to use Aristotle's term political animals. We're political animals, said Aristotle, and by that he simply meant that we find our meaning and we find ourselves in society. So, for example, it's very nice that you're all sitting here listening to me. It'd be a bit sad if I was on my own. So we can only find our true meaning as humans in society, and yet we're animals. What does that mean? It actually means that we also need nature. We can't eat bricks off the ground. We actually need food, and that comes from somewhere that is not the city. So the urban paradox, which is that a city can't feed itself, also expresses the dwelling dilemma, if you like, of political animals like us. So our great question, in a sense, and I was an architect in a former life, I'm still qualified, so I can theoretically still build, is, if you like, how do we dwell? How do you make a place for political animals to dwell? You have to solve the urban paradox. Now, Aristotle also talked about an interesting concept he called economia. And I don't know whether any of you can guess which modern word that is the basis of. Can you? I'll talk a bit more about it and it might come to you. Ecos was the Greek word for house, and nomos was the word meaning management. So economia is household management. And Aristotle lived in Athens, which was a polis. A polis was a city-state, so it was, again, an urban area surrounded by a rural, productive area. And he said the ideal for the polis was that everyone would have a house in the city and a farm in the countryside. And ekos nomos, or economia, household management, is that your farm feeds your house. And if lots of people have houses in the city, and lots of people have farms in the countryside, then the polis is self-sufficient, it feeds itself. And that's economia. Which, have you guessed what the root is of the modern word yet? Thank you very much, exactly. So, take a chocolate, it's very good. So our modern word economy means household management, which goes back to an idea of a city being able to feed itself. Now, interestingly, Aristotle warned about another terrible thing called prematistike, which luckily hasn't made it into modern English. But that was making money for the sake of it. And he said if you started to make money for the sake of it, it was a disaster because the city would never feed itself. It would never reach a point of balance when it knew when to stop at an ideal size. So this is quite interesting. Now, arguably, Rome expressed all the things that Aristotle was terrified by. And it's the first city to grow to 1 million citizens by the 3rd century AD. And as you can see, it's not a tiny little blob of urbanity surrounded by farmland. So how do you think it fed itself? Any ideas? Yes? Trade. Okay, I'll take that. Thank you very much. Very good. So, you may have heard of the term food miles, have you? Does that term come across your radar at all? It simply refers to the distance your foods travel before you eat it. So, for example, if you had a banana for breakfast, surprise, surprise, that didn't grow in Switzerland. It probably came from somewhere in South America. So that probably had about 5,000 food miles attached to it. It's not a new phenomenon. The only way a city the size of Rome could have fed itself is by bringing in food, absolutely, from a long way away, by sea. And in the pre-industrial world, the only way you could transport food long distances was by sea because it was hugely cheaper to just stick a load of grain in a boat and then it could just, under sail power, it could make its way into the city. In fact, the ships from Egypt, which were Rome's major grain port, were like the super tankers of their day. And it was cheaper, believe it or not, to transport grain from the North African coast to the city by sea than it would have been to bring grain in from 20 miles away by land, just because of the difficulty. Imagine enough grain to feed 1 million people coming in every day by ox and cart. Very, very hard. So food miles are not new, but interestingly also, Rome's continuing expansion meant it was very, very difficult for it to manage the empire, and it had to conquer sequentially Sicily, Sardinia, the North African coast, and then ultimately Egypt to feed itself. And this over-expansion actually ultimately led to its downfall. And it's fascinating if you study, in fact, how Rome fed itself, because there are many of the problems we see today already visible 2,000 years ago. So it's a problem of scale. Now, I mean, I'm really sort of skipping very rapidly through history, but roughly 150 years ago, all of that started to change. In fact, 180 years ago, if you look at this, with the coming of railways. And I've written goodbye geography at the bottom of this, because, of course, many of the things I've just been talking to you about change overnight. So the difficulty of transporting food long distances goes away because we can stick it on a train and get it in very easily. Secondly, I mean, something I haven't talked enough about, but, you know, if you think of the Temple of Ur organising the harvest, it was always the city authorities' responsibility to feed the people. And now, for the first time, the industries are going to take over, so the politicians don't have to worry about feeding people anymore, which they're very happy about, because it's very difficult to feed people in many ways. And last but not least, cities are no longer constrained by geography. So instead of, you know, seeing, you know, basically a place they could feed themselves and being constrained at how big they could grow, cities can now grow to any size, a bit like Rome, in fact. So if we look at the consequences of this is London in 1840 when the railways are coming. It's still a very compact, small city, actually not unlike its medieval self. Very, very rapidly it grows and expands to the scale that it couldn't possibly be fed from just one or two little, 5 minutes? Tragic. Okay, I thought I was going so fast, anyway, not fast enough. Anyway, and of course at the same time, the countryside is being transformed. So this is the American Great West in basically pre-industrial times. Millions of bison wandering around a grassland. Within the space of 10 years of the railways coming, the bison is slaughtered, that's a pile of bison skulls, and you end up with monocultural grain production. You also get the beginning of cheap meat. Why? Because there was a grain surplus for the first time in history, and when you have more grain than people can eat, you feed it to animals. That was the economic idea. Really bad idea, by the way, because cows get sick if they eat green. But anyway, that's how cheap meat, the idea of cheap meat was created. That's the Chicago stockyards, which became the meatpacking centre of the world, exported to the East Coast and all over Europe. Of course, converting grassland to monocultural grain production was a really bad idea because the soils couldn't take that kind of farming. I don't have time to explain why, but maybe it'll come up in a discussion. So the Dust Bowl was a great ecological catastrophe when all the soil of the great American Midwest just blew away. And that's the beginning of a discussion that is raging still today, which is industrial versus organic. Do we feed the world by having these monocultural systems, fertilised by artificial nitrogenous fertilisers? The Haber-Bosch process made that possible. Justus Liebig is the German chemist who discovered the nutrients that plants needed. Or do we farm organically? This is Albert Howard who hated this system and said, actually, it's all about the living soil, and that's where we get our real nutrition. So, as I say, we have this fiction called cheap food, which doesn't exist, and we've done it by externalising the true cost of food. These are some of them. Climate change, climate gases that Mark was talking about in the keynote, lost and degraded soils, fresh water being rapidly used up, irreplaceable, eutrophication, which is runoff of excess fertiliser into lakes, obesity and, of course, undernourishment as well, a livestock revolution where we're feeding grain to animals, but it's a hugely inefficient way of producing food. Huge numbers of energy going in. For every calorie we eat, we're spending 10 on the food production system, and mass extinction because all the animals are being killed off with this kind of production. So the world is turning into a hamburger because all the embedded power in the food system is based on this model, and this is halfway through my lecture and I think I've got about 2 minutes left, so I've really got to go rapidly now. Okay, as I said earlier, what are we going to do about this? And I said it's not a new question. In fact, this is my favourite image of, if you like, an ideal relationship between the city and the countryside. It comes from 14th century Siena, and it's just basically saying there has to be a balance between the city and the countryside, in fact, a symbiosis. And it's an idea that gets repeated in utopian thinking, so Plato talked about it, so did Aristotle, Thomas More, the idea of going back to a city-state idea, and Ebenezer Howe's garden city model was the same. So you have a network of small urban blobs surrounded by farmland, and they're all connected. So you, as it were, you have the benefits both of rural and urban. But of course, none of these projects actually came to fruition in the way their proponents intended for one way or another, and that's actually because utopia can't exist, because it's a good place or it's no place. And I remember finding this really depressing when I was researching utopia, but I thought, well, actually, our worlds and our lives are shaped by food, so maybe we could have sitopia instead. So that's from the Greek word sitos, which means food, and topos, which means place. And we just simply live in a world shaped by food. It's just badly shaped by food because we don't value food. But what if we did? So this is how food travels through our lives, from the countryside to distribution systems, markets and supermarkets, the kitchen. This is where we actually encounter it, when we eat it, and then back in the waste system. It goes round and round and round. But it's much more complicated than that, and actually I really agreed with Mark about complexity, because every stage of that system affects every other stage. But ultimately, all of those moments, so production, buying and selling, cooking, eating, and so on, they all have profound effects on our landscapes, whether we meet in the middle of a city, or whether we go out of the city to buy our food in a supermarket, whether we eat together, whether we eat in cars. 19% of meals in America are now eaten in a car, which is just weird, isn't it? Cows eating grass, or cows, that's a concentrated animal feeding operation with 160,000 animals walking around, eating grain and getting sick and being pumped full of antibiotics. So which of these actually feed into a good life? Now this then leads us to question, well, what is a good life? And it's very interesting that we've inherited this idea that farming is what people used to do, working in an office is kind of great, and it's going to be really fantastic in the future because we're going to have robots doing it all for us, and we're just going to hang around all day doing what? I've no idea. Anyway, so I think there's a really powerful model that we have to rethink about what a good life is. We need to value food. Food is living things that we kill in order to live. How can that be cheap? If we say food is cheap, we're saying life is cheap. So it's really, really important that we understand the true value of food. Once you do that, it's interesting. You look at times when food's been scarce, like London during the war, Cuba after the fall of the Soviet Union, Detroit after the motor cars left. People immediately, the first thing they said is, how are we going to eat? And they started growing food, because it is the most important thing in all our lives. We don't see it because, as I said at the beginning, without it we wouldn't be here. It's too big to see. But we have to work with nature and not against it. And again, I can talk about this more in the discussion, but essentially organic, working with soil is the way forward. And we have to address something else that Mark also talked about, which is power lines. This is what the food system looks like at the moment. Producers and consumers separated by just a tiny handful of people who make all of those connections. We need a democratised food system which looks more like this. And this is joining the roots to the branches, if you like. And it's what Carlo Petrini's concept of co-producing is, which means you don't just receive food like a sort of, passive blob, but you actually go out and you meet the producers halfway. You might get involved, you might have a food co-op, a box scheme, CSA's community supported agriculture, where you actually pay the farmer in advance to feed you, and you might even go and work on the farm. So it's joining the city to the country, making space for food, thinking about it, post-fitting food into existing cities, planning new cities with food in the mix. This is a project just east of Amsterdam. Patchwork farms, so cities can't feed themselves, but it's very important to have some food growing in the city because it makes it visible, it gets us engaged and interested, and it's just fun, apart from anything else. Markets, also infrastructure. This is a local abattoir. If you're going to raise animals ethically, you need to kill them ethically too. And the SDGs, which Mark also talked about, and I think exactly as he does, food is the one thing that connects all of the Sustainable Development Goals together. You can reach all of them through it. So it's a wonderful way of addressing all of those things. So to summarise, and I apologise for the enormous arc I've covered really rapidly, not quite rapidly enough apparently, it's basically understanding that food shapes our lives in many ways that we see, but many ways that we also don't see. So our bodies, our habits, our landscapes, our homes, our cities, our entire society. And if we see the world through food, and if we value food, then we can use food as a really powerful, connective way of making a better world. So thank you very much. And